enables enormous societal benefits, improving sustainability, access to healthcare and public safety, expanding access to education and financial services, and furthering economic growth. Now, policymakers around the world are working to harness the benefits of AI while also assessing challenges that may emerge. The tech industry takes very seriously our responsibility as enablers of a world with AI, including protecting consumers and helping to train the workforce of the future. Today, we're going to hear from leading voices from the public and private sector and from both sides of the Atlantic who are working hard to advance the transformative technology of AI. Our conversation will explore how government and industry can work together to allow for continued AI innovation and growth while also building trust in AI applications. Now, we encourage you to be part of the conversation today by using the hashtag #BridgeForInnovation on your favorite social media application. And now let's get right into today's conversation. It's my honor to introduce you all to U.S. Congresswoman Robin Kelly. Congresswoman Kelly represents Illinois' 2nd District. She serves as Vice Chair of the Energy and Commerce Committee, and in that capacity, she works to promote technology policies that advance lives. Her priorities include ensuring that Americans are prepared to leverage AI and use it as a positive tool. Congresswoman Kelly, the good people of Illinois' 2nd District spoke loudly and firmly last week in returning you as their representative to Washington. So hearty congratulations to you on that. Thank you for taking time out of your incredibly busy schedule to be with us today. And it's my pleasure to turn over the virtual podium to you to share your thoughts with us today.
Thank you so much, Jason. It's great to be with you. And hello and good morning. It's great to be with all of you, albeit virtually. It is a bit of a hectic week in DC following the midterm election, but we're hoping for a productive lame duck session as members continue negotiations on an omnibus appropriations package ahead of the expiration of the current continuing resolution, and hope to finalize negotiations on the National Defense Authorization Act. Maybe even federal privacy law will pass. I know there's been active discussions the past few weeks, and hopefully my colleagues in California will feel comfortable and we can advance the American Data Privacy and Protection Act to the House floor. I'm sorry that I'll have to leave before my friend Dragoș Tudorache speaks. In 2020, I testified before his special committee on artificial intelligence in a digital age. It was a little different being on the other side of the dais, but it was a great exchange of ideas and was very helpful for me to hear what members of the European Parliament prioritize around transatlantic cooperation on AI. What is clear is that we're both trying to solve the same problems, but sometimes with different perspectives. So I want to commend ITI for putting forth materials like the AI transparency principles to help policymakers as we put together legislation. Trust is central to every discussion around AI. I come at this from the standpoint of the normal person on the street. Most people don't know that they've utilized AI and that it's already out in the world. If the average person doesn't trust AI systems, or if systems are deployed in a reckless manner that will cause real harms, then it will severely damage the progression of AI development. Data shows that people who look like me are most likely to be negatively impacted by AI. That's why attention to unintended bias is critically important, so prejudices in the real world are not transferred to the digital world. When I first held hearings with former Rep. Will Hurd on the House Oversight IT Subcommittee, we kept hearing about explainability, transparency, and interpretability. When we talked to different experts, we got different explanations of what each meant and which is needed. Getting the terminology right is so important as we are still wrestling with definitions and vocabulary around artificial intelligence. I think the NIST AI framework has helped. I hear from companies that want to be good actors, but uncertainty and a lack of clarity makes it a difficult field to navigate. What we don't want to happen is to create two very different sets of laws and definitions in the EU and the US around AI. I know that we tend to work at different speeds, where generally the US Congress is playing catch up to the EU on digital laws, but there is a desire to get this right. We're still working to pass our version of the GDPR. The federal privacy law we passed out of the House Energy and Commerce Committee takes some of the first concrete steps to put guardrails around AI's potential harms. The bill would create national standards and safeguards for personal information collected by companies, including protections intended to address potentially discriminatory impacts of algorithms. It would also require certain impact assessments and design evaluations. Getting the details right is important, and I've heard from many companies and consumer groups following the ENC markup of the privacy bill. We want to pass something that will have the desired result, make people safer online, and allow for AI to develop in a responsible manner that is not overly burdensome for companies. I want to thank everyone for participating in the discussion and ensuring that all communities can benefit from AI. Getting everyone at the table to build trust will be necessary for this technology to deploy responsibly. Thank you again to ITI for having me on, and I hope you have a great panel discussion next. Have a great day.
Thank you so much, Congresswoman Kelly. We appreciate your leadership on all of these important issues and appreciate your continued attention to the transatlantic dialogue at the same time. The importance, as you noted, of the work that the EU and the US are doing in collaboration with one another. And we'll hear with Dragoș Tudorache, the MEP who has been active on this issue, in just a little while during this program today. We appreciate your being with us today to discuss these important issues. And speaking of these important issues, we now have the opportunity to transition to a panel discussion with industry experts who are going to share with us their views on the important policy discussions that are taking place in the EU and in the US. Please join me in welcoming our three industry experts who will engage in a dialogue with us. We will then transition from that dialogue to a conversation, as I mentioned, with MEP Tudorache to talk about the EU perspective. So it's my great pleasure to introduce to you Norberto Andrade, who leads Meta's strategic policy engagement on AI around the globe. Thank you for being with us today, Norberto. Kristen Verderame is Vice President of Government Relations at NetApp, a global cloud and data-centric software company. And Grace Yi leads the Global Office of Ethical Innovation at Adobe. So, Norberto, Kristen, Grace, thank you so much for being here with us today at ITI. Look forward to your reactions to what Congresswoman Kelly had to say. But first, I want to start at what we might call the 50,000-foot level. And Norberto, first question goes to you to share your perspective and that of Meta. And that is, as we talk to policymakers about AI, as we endeavor to inform the policymaking process, we have a lot of education to do about AI because, as Congresswoman Kelly mentioned, the perspective of members of Congress and members of the European Parliament and other decision makers around the world is also the perspective of consumers, people who use AI, who want to understand how it impacts them in their personal lives. So I'm curious to hear, Norberto, your thoughts on what aspects of AI, what aspects of the technology itself need to be better understood by policymakers as they continue to analyze it and explore potential regulatory or legislative approaches to AI.
Thank you. Thanks, Jason. And first of all, thank you so much for the invitation and the opportunity to speak with all of you and tell a little bit of the work that we're doing at Meta on these important issues. Delving directly into your question, I think there are a number of important aspects of AI technology that need to be understood and taken into account when thinking about governance and regulation of this technology. I would start with the fact that AI is dynamic and iterative in nature. So when we try to define AI, we are immediately faced with the challenge of trying to go for a definition that would not be too broad, but also not too narrow. So we don't want a definition that would be overly focused on detailed and prescriptive description of the underlying technical elements of AI. So what we need to do is focus on AI as software that learns. So we know that many software systems make decisions, but what makes AI truly unique and what raises a number of governance questions around fairness and accountability, just to name a few, is that modern AI systems learn to make decisions. They do not only make decisions, they have a learning process that leads to that decision. And this enables these systems to come up with very important decisions around human level cognitive acts like driving a car or playing chess or making judgments about someone's job application. So rather than having these decisions being based on hard-coded rules, there's a learning and an evolving process that underlies this process that I think needs to be taken into account and better understood. The other that I would mention is obviously the complexity and the opacity of AI systems, certain AI systems. It's something that we all know that the AI community as a whole, including policymakers, are working to better understand and respond to. So there is the need to reduce the opacity of AI systems, and that is emerging as a very active and important research area. So when people do not understand how AI powered products and services come up with their results and decisions, they might be less likely to trust them. So at Meta, we have developed tools to improve the transparency and explainability of our systems. I won't go into details, but we have tools like why are you seeing this, or system cards that provide users with a level of explanation that help them understand and help them also trust and have a greater control over their experience of these AI powered products. The other characteristic that I would mention is the fact that in certain situations, AI systems, for the sake of its responsible development, needs to leverage sensitive attributes to mitigate issues of bias and fairness. So in order to address potential unfairness implications of these AI systems, we firstly need to be able to detect and measure that unfairness. And this is challenging because it's challenging to address what we cannot measure. So AI developers actually, in some situations, need access to sensitive data in order to better determine how well their AI models are working for people of different races and ethnicities. And here we have an interesting challenge and tension that on the one hand, and for algorithmic fairness reasons, there is a need for collection and processing of sensitive data. But if we look at privacy and data protection, that collection and processing is difficult to be attained. There's a high threshold for very legitimate reasons. There's a high threshold of consent for collection of sensitive personal data, but that might create some struggles for AI developers to have access to the data that they need in order to ensure that their AI systems are not producing unfair outcomes. So in order to know if AI models are actually impacting certain groups of people, we need to define the attributes that may amount to sensitive data. And this is an interesting discussion, and I'll finish here, that we see also in the EU Act about how to solve this challenge and this tension. We saw that the first proposal of the EU Act proposed by the European Commission anticipated a specific legal basis for the processing of sensitive data exactly for fairness measurement purposes. We've seen that the European Parliament, in some versions of its amendments, actually challenged that legal basis. So this is an evolving debate that we have now. But just to recap, it's important to understand the importance of leveraging, collecting, and processing this type of data to make sure that the systems work responsibly and in a fair way. So let me finish it for.
That's terrific, Norberto. And you raise a really interesting point about the fact that the access to data, which we may consider sensitive data, or policymakers may consider sensitive data, is actually the best way to make sure the AI is doing what it's supposed to do and making sure it is programmed correctly and making sure it's not acting in a way that we don't want it to act. And it's true across a variety of different areas. I know one of the issues in the AI Act is access to sensitive medical data, for example, and manufacturers of medical devices who deploy AI need access to that medical data to make sure the diagnoses are happening correctly, so the AI can pull from the biggest possible database of information about medical information to make sure the diagnosis is correct. Without that access to that sensitive data, the AI simply doesn't work, and that's true across multiple areas. And your note about transparency is also very interesting. Of course, the ITI principles that have been referenced a couple of times already are focused on and are actually called transparency in AI, to make sure that people know what's happening with that information, make sure it's being used for good. And speaking of that educational component of AI deployment, Kristen, I wanted to turn to you for your perspective and NetApp's perspective on this educational component of our policy work, making sure that policymakers are not making these decisions in a vacuum, but in fact are collaborating with industry, with academia, with community stakeholders. And I know this is something that you've been very focused on, and NetApp has been very focused on. Can you share with us your perspective on that kind of collaboration, why it's important for policymakers to work with outside stakeholders as they decide how and when and where to regulate AI?
Sure, of course. I think AI is no different than any other technology. The government will have principles, it will have goals, it will have benchmarks it wants to set that may be based on really good ideas and for really good reasons. But the reality can sometimes be that technology may not actually be able to do the things that they hope that it can do or would like it to do. So without sitting down at the table with industry to figure out, what are we actually doing? Where's the technology now? Where can it go? Coming up with rules that don't match that is really not very helpful. So we spent a lot of time in the industry advisory groups, including working with ITI. IT Sector Coordinating Council is a great example. It's a group that is an industry advisory group representing the IT industry, and it advises a Department of Homeland Security's cybersecurity agency. One of the projects we've undertaken recently in our Emerging Tech Working Group is on the security of AI. We hear a lot about bias, transparency, all the things you guys have talked about already. We see Congress throwing lots and lots of money at agencies saying, go do AI. I'm not sure agencies still really quite know what that means, so they're trying to figure that out. But in the meantime, we don't hear a lot of discussion about the security of AI. As Norberto said, if you have models that actually aren't safeguarded and aren't running properly, bad actors can get into those models and change them. You're not going to get the results you intended, whether it's from a bias perspective or a national security perspective, frankly. Same thing with the data itself. For those of you who don't know NetApp, we're basically all things data, data management, data storage, data security, all of that. If you don't actually lock down that data, the sensitive data you're talking about, Jason, can be acquired by bad actors. It can be infiltrated and made not with no veracity, right? So that then when you run the AI processes, you get results you don't intend or that could actually be very bad for the country. Similarly, the operations themselves, and Norberto, you made this point, if you're not actually checking the end game to say, is this about what we expected to get, to make sure the operations themselves are what we want and have not been affected, you might end up with bad results from that as well. So securing the AI bigger picture is something we're working with CISA on and looking at best practices for that. How do we effectively do that? To your point, Jason, government has goals. They want us to do certain things. They're telling all the agencies to go do AI, but let's figure out what some of those best practices are so that that's actually successful. The technology up to speed and can match it, yeah, but also protecting against some of these things that really have not been considered by the policymakers up front.
Grace, I want to ask you about that last element that Kristen mentioned, and that is avoiding negative uses of AI and making sure that there's transparency about the potential for harm. You know, it's hard to have a conversation about technology and focus on the negative because AI has so many incredible uses, and it's going to be a technology that makes lives better. But of course, policymakers are focused on potential negative use. And Grace, I wanted to ask you about how we should, as an industry, be approaching questions about potential negative uses of AI. I'm particularly delighted to have you here to talk about Adobe's perspective, because Adobe, and we could spend all day talking about this, has deployed technologies to help answer those questions about negative use across multiple different areas of content. For example, your digital watermarking technologies help us make sure that documents are legitimate, and Adobe is in the process of bringing to market technologies to make sure that video and audio content is legitimate. So those technologies are all terrific. But with AI, we're talking about potential use of the technology that, as we heard from Congresswoman Kelly, raises some very serious concerns. So how do you at Adobe, and how do you, Grace, in your work, look at these questions of potential bias? How do we address it? How do we mitigate it? And how do we interact with policymakers to get them enthusiastic about the technology and help them understand that the tech industry takes these issues very seriously?
Thanks, Jason. I just wanted to underscore some of the comments that Congresswoman Kelly brought up around impact assessments and unintended bias. And so, assessing the ethical impact of an AI feature will actually help us develop AI that's more responsibly and more ethically, while mitigating the harmful bias that can come from AI. So at Adobe, like what we have is we have a standardized review process for our AI features, which includes an impact assessment that product teams are required to fill out before their product goes to production. This impact assessment it's a multi-part assessment that's really designed to capture the ethical impact of an AI feature. And what, for us, like we've seen that for most products and features, the impact assessment shows that there's no major ethical risks for our customers. But for the ones that, in the other cases, those products go through a more rigorous like testing and evaluation process, which, in some cases may require the product team to do a presentation in front of our AI ethics review board. And as during that review, each board member on the review board can actually ask questions to the product teams, but ultimately they must provide approval before the product can be released to production. This process helps us focuses the attention of the review board on those products and features that have a higher potential ethical impact for our customers, but continuing to allow innovation to flourish. So this is one of those mechanisms that we have in place to, assess, to make sure that there's no unintended negative bias that can come from the AI, but also making sure that the AI, the intention of what we wanted the feature to do is still there.
Norberto, I want to come back to you on the question of how we can assure policymakers that AI is done in the right way, and that the human beings that are programming AI algorithms and developing AI related software tools are doing the right thing. Because, of course, at the end of the day, the big concern about AI is it's machines doing things that human beings normally do. And yet, at the same time, the principal benefit of AI is that it takes some of those human biases out of the equation. And if done correctly, if programmed correctly, if given access to the right amount of data, AI can be an enormous beneficial tool for solving some of the harms that we see in a variety of different areas, ranging from bias in lending to healthcare outcomes and everything in between. So, Norberto, I mentioned earlier that ITI has published these new policy principles for enabling transparency in AI systems, and I would commend all of our audience to go to ITI's website, itic.org, and take a look at those policy principles, because they really are focused on helping global governments with the important policy decisions that need to be made to ensure the success of AI. But the real focus, because it's, again, the most important question that comes up, is about the transparency that needs to be integrated into policies that encourage responsible AI development, deployment, and innovation. So, Norberto, from your perspective, how can we ensure that AI technology continues to be developed and deployed and used in a secure and trustworthy and transparent manner?
Sure. So let me give you a couple of examples touching, I'll get to transparency, but I could start with how to ensure fairness. At Meta, through our responsible AI team, we have established what we call our 5 pillars of responsible AI. 2 of them are on fairness and inclusion, the other is on transparency and control. So let me give you a couple of examples of how we actually implement those principles in practice at the company. So starting with fairness and inclusion, we've been working on a tool called the Fairness Flow that basically helps our machine learning engineers detect certain forms of potential statistical bias on AI models and labels that are commonly used in the company. And this allows them to be able to consider possible solutions, which might include broadening or improving the representation within their training data sets, or to examine whether certain features are important or explore more complex or less complex models. So we're talking about a technical toolkit that enables our teams to analyze how some types of models and labels perform across different groups. It's a sort of a diagnostic tool. It will not resolve fairness concerns on its own, but it can provide the necessary insight to help us understand how some systems are performing across user groups. In terms of transparency and control, which is one of the other pillars of responsible AI, there are also a number of tools and processes that we are putting in place. When greater transparency is required, we've used model cards that can be defined as a sort of methods for creating simple and standardized documentation of AI models. So we've actually produced model cards to accompany some of our research announcements, including No Language Left Behind. This is a model that is capable of translating directly between 200 languages, including low resources languages like Urdu, and also a large language model that we've deployed called OPT 175B. So what is interesting about these model cards is that they do work well, obviously on a model by model basis, but they do not provide explanations into AI systems, where the series of models create signals into other models that ultimately provide a user experience and form an AI system. So to solve for this and to actually provide system level transparency, we have designed what we call system cards. And these look across multiple models, assess how they're working together to form an AI system. The system card has 2 main parts. It combines a step-by-step walkthrough of how AI powers an experience. This is sort of how it works. And the second part is an interactive demo for self-validating understanding, sort of now you try it. Because research has shown that these 2 features, the step-by-step explanation and the self-demonstration, work very well together to help people understand how AI powers an experience and increases their confidence into those AI-powered products. Our first AI system card actually shows how the Instagram feed ranking works. We've also, in terms of transparency and control, been also introducing a number of tools over the years to increase transparency around why people are seeing certain pieces of content in their news feed and ads that they're exposed to. So these why am I seeing this, or what we call waste tools, are a means for enabling users to better understand and control their experience on our apps. So I'll finish here with this examples, but happy to elaborate more on others that we have
Great, thanks.
been doing as well.
Great, thanks, Norberto. And I love the WASTE acronym. Why am I seeing this? That works well. And it answers the question that we always have. When we're browsing our Facebook feeds. How did Facebook know that I wanted to see something like that? Well, the answer is because Facebook pays attention to what I want to see and what I don't want to see. And that's the magic of AI. It works well. Grace, and then Kristen, I want to ask you the same questions that Norberto just addressed about how you set the company up to take on these issues, how you constitute a team, how you put the tools in place, how you develop the internal capability to address these questions. And Grace, I'll start with you. I want to ask you about how you've designed the internal operation at Adobe to make sure that people are paying attention to these issues, that transparency is part of the process of developing and deploying new technology tools. How has the team been set up to address this successfully, and what are some of the tools that you're working on or have deployed to make sure these transparency and trust issues are part of the product development and product deployment?
So I think, in addition to all the tools that Norberto mentioned, that companies have in place to help assess, mitigate all of the harmful bias that come from AI. And I think about like impact assessments and the governance process that we have here at Adobe as like a tool that companies can use. I think one of the things that's really important as well is diversity. So diversity is really important when developing AI responsibly and ethically. So at Adobe, we believe that having diverse human oversight over the life cycle of an AI is important. And for us, that means having a diverse ethics review board, getting feedback from a volunteer group of employees when it's appropriate, and then making sure we have feedback mechanisms for our customers. So our AI ethics review board is composed of a cross-functional group of Adobe employees who have diverse racial, gender, and professional backgrounds. We believe that this type of diversity is critical to identifying issues that a less diverse team may not see. And so let me give you an example of that. In our Photoshop product, we have a feature called neural filters. This neural filters feature allows a user to change the facial expressions, modifies the hairstyle, or age or de-age a person using AI. So during the review of that feature, one of the board members noted that the hairstyle of a particular community wasn't being modeled accurately. And so because the product team was in the review with the review board, they heard that, they took that feedback, and they went and updated the feature before it went out to production. In some cases, we find that, having a volunteer group of employees test the AI and then provide their unique perspective before it goes to production is also another way we look at diversity. And then finally, having feedback mechanisms for our customers to report concerns across our AI practices and products is important. So, we believe that bringing our customers and our Adobe community along on the journey with us can help us make sure that we're actually all working together and looking at the AI from all these different unique perspectives so that we can actually design and implement AI responsibly. Because I think, AI is really built by humans. We all have unconscious bias that falls in there. And so we do need that kind of collective perspective from everyone to actually figure out, see if there is maybe some unintended unconscious bias that's coming from the AI.
That's fascinating. The human element that you introduce into not only the production of the AI, but then the end product to make sure that unintended consequences aren't there. It's a great way of taking care to make sure that you apply every possible filter to both the data that goes into the AI and what the AI produces. Really a fascinating way to do it and to engage a cross-section of Adobe to help apply those extra layers of check to the AI technology in the market. Terrific. Kristen, wanted to ask you for how NetApp looks at this issue. We've been talking about the importance of internal teams and considering a variety of different viewpoints, both on the data sets that go into AI and what happens when the AI is launched. What's NetApp's approach to this cross-team functionality to make sure it's done correctly?
So we are not the ones who actually do AI. We're the ones that support those who do AI. Yeah. So we sit behind the Adobes and the Metas of the world to provide the secure databases, to provide snapshots to make sure the veracity of the data is confirmed each time, that the training that is being run actually comes out the way it should be. So what we do is we work with the customers on the back end to prepare everything and lock everything down and provide processes to make sure that it does work the way it's supposed to be. It enables these two great companies to do all the things that they're talking about. We do have a trust center that we've stood up globally for all of our customers. It talks to privacy, it talks to compliance, it talks to AI, so that any customer who has a question about how we handle certain things, what our products support, all those different parts that relate to those concerns for them, they can go at a glance and see what we're doing, what's in our product, bill of materials, supply chain, all of those things that go into the veracity of when you're using the operations off your data. In addition, to make sure that we're holistic as well, I think we all have the same viewpoint on that. We have an AI community at NetApp, which is comprised of many different parts of the company, from sales, what are the customers asking for, what are they wanting, what are they concerned about, to thought leadership. What are the messages that we think are helpful so that people do use these ethically, so that risks are considered properly. Many different parts of the business feed into these conversations every 6 weeks. And then we have a lot of actions that we spread out back across the business afterwards. So it's a very holistic approach at NetApp on this topic for sure. Focus mostly on supporting those who do AI rather than the AI we are doing ourselves. That makes sense.
It does. And Kristen, I want to stay with you for just a second to talk a little bit more about how we can communicate that this is happening to policymakers. You mentioned in your opening remarks that you are the co-chair of the Emerging Tech Working Group, actually co-chair with ITI's Courtney Lang, who we'll be hearing from in just a few minutes as she moderates our discussion with MEP Tudorache. But this is part of the Sector Coordinating Council, the IT Sector Coordinating Council. So I want to ask you a little bit more about that group and if it is a good model for us to look to for collaboration between government and industry, and also as we look overseas and prepare for our conversation with MEP Tudorache, is there an opportunity for industry to look for government partnerships there as well? So just looking for some good practice tips from you as you're participating in one of the most important AI public-private sector partnerships to make these things successful.
Sure. So I participated in the IT Sector Coordinating Council for several years. I think it's a great organization. For those who are unfamiliar, Department of Homeland Security has several sector coordinating councils of the various sectors: IT, communications, retail, financial services, across the board. It's open to the public. Any company can join. It's free of charge to participate, so that's always a good thing. And it's a great way to engage directly with the different areas within DHS on a variety of issues. So a few years ago, Courtney, my partner in crime on a lot of this, she and I were talking about how we really would like to address quantum, AI, 5G, some of these emerging technologies that we're seeing in the marketplace more directly with CISA. And so we stood up the Emerging Tech Working Group together. And so since then, we've worked with CISA on 5G. We've had a lot of speakers in to talk about AI and what the government's doing, right? Explaining the blueprint for the AI Bill of Rights from the White House, the 5G implementation plan, that sort of thing. And now we're working with CISA more directly on coming up with best practices, as I said, for AI security, the security of AI. So we've come up with an agenda outline of the topics we want to hit. CISA has agreed those, and we have a first meeting of our working group, in fact, this afternoon, to start talking about how we do this. So I can tell you, Jason, I was in Brussels a few weeks ago, and things like the AI Bill of Rights that the White House has proposed are of great interest to the European authorities. The NIST framework has always been of interest, very similar risk-based framework to what the AI Act is, so it's not that different, actually. The level of industry engagement over there is quite strong. They were saying that they really welcome that, of course. So I think there's a lot of opportunity to follow the IT Sector Coordinating Council model into other fora as well. They have their own very similar ones, but we have found the ITSEC to be super helpful for bringing in issues. CISA has been very engaging. They've been very thoughtful. We meet with them literally in person once a month with the leadership of the two, and really welcome the opportunity to come in and provide thoughtful input as they're considering different things. And we actually put that on their agenda. We put the AI security piece on their agenda. So it's been a great opportunity to work with them.
Terrific. And Norberto, I want to come back to you on this question of partnering with global policymakers as well, and specifically ask you about Open Loop, which did a recent report actually on AI. And the report was called the Artificial Intelligence Act, a Policy Prototyping Experiment. I love that title because the idea of prototyping policy is very similar to what we do in the technology industry. We prototype new technologies, but here we're trying out a new policy approach. And I wanted to ask you about it. So tell me a little bit about what Open Loop was looking to explore with this policy prototyping approach to AI, and what do you hope will come from it?
Sure. So just taking a step back and very quickly describing what Open Loop is. This is a global program that we launched 2 years ago. And basically what we try to do is to better connect policy makers and technology companies. And the whole goal is to help develop effective and evidence-based policies around AI. It builds really on the collaboration and contribution of a large consortium that may be composed of regulators, governments, tech businesses, but also academics and civil society. So we are championing and putting in practice specific experimental governance methods. There's a lot of hype around regulatory sandboxes that we very much welcome, but we also believe that there's more that we can do in terms of experimentation. And one way to do this is to actually embark in policy prototyping programs. So what is this? Basically, and this is really the gist of what Open Loop is, it is a methodology through which we try to attain those empirical and evidence-based input that we need to better contribute and inform the legislative debate. So how does it work? First, we started by gathering a group of tech companies, working and providing products and services powered by AI technologies. These are the participants of the Open Loop program. And secondly, we co-create normative frameworks, or we test existing ones. And this is what we call by policy prototypes. So we can co-create a normative framework in certain regions that are starting their debate on this topic, or we can test existing normative frameworks like the draft proposal of the EU Act and test specifically those normative frameworks, assessing, for example, the clarity, the feasibility, and the cost effectiveness of its requirements. So basically, we ask the participants that we gather, the companies, to apply in practice in their own business processes development those prototypes, and we ask questions around how clear it is, how operational, what are the challenges that you are facing, what are the costs that you will need to incur in order to follow those prototypes, and we observe and document that process. We try to understand what companies are doing when following those prototypes, and we derive actionable policy insights and recommendations from that process. We've been doing this in different regions. We've partnered in Singapore with the Info Media Development Authority. We actually helped them test their AI model governance framework in the topic of transparency and explainability. We've created a whole new normative framework on transparency and explainability as well in Mexico with the Data Protection Authority there. And most recently, and as you were mentioning, Jensen, we've launched this EU Act program in terms of Open Loop in Europe. And we were able to gather over 60 participants from 53 AI startups and companies operating in the EU to collect their feedback on specific key provisions of the EU AI Act, on risk assessment, on transparency. We are also testing the provision on regulatory sandboxes, for example, to understand how attractive that section can actually be for startups that want to embark in this type of processes. And we're also looking, for example, at the taxonomy of actors to understand if this binary distinction between an AI provider and an AI user is sufficient to cover the complexity and granularity of the AI ecosystem. We have a working assumption that we actually need to be more granular, and we will be testing with companies for an alternative taxonomy. So basically, Open Loop is really a way for us to more closely work with lawmakers, with regulators providing these methodologies through which we can derive this empirical feedback, and hopefully through those programs provide inputs like the one that we've just launched, the first report of this open loop program in the EU Act, to better inform the debates that are now occurring regarding this draft legislation.
Yeah, and it's interesting. Your AI work with Open Loop also involved a number of EU member state regulatory agencies, including some of the smaller countries like Malta and Estonia that are, probably not thought of as taking the lead on AI regulation, but it's great to involve the member states directly in that effort as well, because you got to educate, particularly as the AI Act was really started to be rolled out this summer across Europe. The individual regulators and the individual member states are obviously going to play a role in this. So it's terrific that you involved those member states as well.
Sorry, Jason, I would just add. So apart from having the partners from governments and member states, we actually also have members of the European Parliament as observers. In the workshop where we presented this report, we had actually MEP Dragoș Tudorache presenting his views. So this was a way to actually build this platform through which we can directly debate these issues, and has proven to be quite successful so far.
Terrific. And I'm sure we'll have the opportunity to ask him about this in just a few minutes when he joins us. And my colleague, Courtney Lang, who was the principal author of our AI transparency report that came out in September, we'll also be talking about the work that ITI has done around these areas. And I'm curious, I want to come back to Grace and Kristen, and then circle back to you, Norberto, as well, on this question of the AI Act in Europe, and particularly as we get ready to talk about the EU approach, what your kind of wish list of policy activity or things that you think that the European Union needs to be looking at in particular. Kristen, I know you were just in Brussels talking directly to members of the European Parliament and the Commission about these issues. And Grace, obviously, Adobe operates around the world and has to pay attention to regulatory questions that arise in multiple jurisdictions. So, Kristen, I'll start with you on the subject of the EU regulatory landscape. Obviously, the AI Act is new. As I mentioned, just rolled out really starting in June of 2022. So we're still kind of digesting what's going to come as a result of the AI Act. But we know that European decision makers are candidly far ahead of the US in setting out a roadmap for regulation. A lot of discussion in Congress, but not as much action as there has been in the EU. So as you have your discussions in Brussels, Kristen, what are you focused on? What are you most keen to see European regulators understand about the impact of the AI Act and other actions they're considering? What's on your wish list of policy priorities that you're discussing with the EU?
I don't think we have anything, we're super specific that we were asking for. It was more a matter of how is this going to be implemented, right? I believe the framework is pretty sound. I love the risk-based approach. I think the way they've pulled out the different levels of risk and identified the types of use cases that fall into the different categories, I think make perfect sense. It's how this is all going to be rolled out in the end. And it goes back to your point, Jason, about why include industry, right? How does this actually work when it's rolled out at the end of the day? There are some instances of AI use cases where you do have to make sure that bias is not going into the process overall. There's other use cases of AI where the human piece is actually an integral part, and not necessarily bias, but human judgment can come into part that is quite important. We're working with the Veterans Administration on their suicide prevention efforts right now. How do we improve that? The AI is a key tool that we're using in helping to predict when difficult situations may be arising. But at the end of the day, you have 5 different pieces of data that you're looking at that AI has thrown up to say, hey, maybe this person might be at risk. Someone, a human, then actually needs to look at it and say, maybe that's not right, or maybe there's this situation, right? The human piece can't be underestimated. So making sure that when the European authorities roll out the act that they've proposed. And it is a regulation, it's not a directive, so we know it's going to be immediately effective, but devil's in the details, right? How do you actually then implement it? That was really the focus of our conversations.
Interesting conversation, and it's good that you're spending time having those conversations in Brussels. Grace, I wanted to come to you with that EU policymaker decision. Obviously, we're about to hear from the MEP who's been most active on the AI Act, and I know these conversations are continuing in Brussels as they are in the U.S. And as Congresswoman Kelly also mentioned, she's keen to see Congress step up efforts to protect consumers. And ensure that there is transparency in the legal requirements here in the U.S. Grace, what's on your wish list, on Adobe's wish list for things that EU policymakers should be thinking about?
Yeah, I think it's actually the same things that Kristen brought up, which is really, we're encouraged to see the risk-based approach that the EU AI Act is adopting. And then I think it's really just kind of seeing how it's implemented. I think what's been encouraging for us is, I think the EU AI Act, as well as, the NISC AI framework, they've done a lot of work to seek feedback from industry stakeholders and really trying to make it actionable, because I think that's really the key with a lot of these frameworks or regulations that are being proposed is we want to make sure that it's actionable and it's relevant and it makes sense for companies, because we want to make sure, I think ultimately the goal is for companies to develop AI responsibly and ethically for all communities around the world. And I think having this global approach will really allow us to share key findings, build off of that shared knowledge, leverage all of the work that's already been done in this space. And so I think that's been important as well. And then, I think there's, like I said, we're encouraged to see that similar terminology also is being adopted in a lot of these, in the NIST AI risk framework, in OEC's recommendations on AI, as well as in the EU AI Act. So I think, if we have a global harmonization of AI regulations, it'll really allow us to harness the power of AI while mitigating harmful bias for communities around the world.
That makes a lot of sense. And Norberto, I'm going to come to you on this question as well, and also harken back to a comment that Congresswoman Kelly made that I thought was really interesting. She noted that she had testified before the European Parliament and before Dragoș Tudorache, and she noted that the EU and the US are, as she put it, both trying to solve the same problems, but they're coming at it with a different perspective on each side of the Atlantic. So I wanted to ask you about your wish list for European policymakers, but also for you to comment on Congresswoman Kelly's observation about the different approach that maybe you're seeing between policymakers in the U.S. and policymakers in the EU. Obviously, technology doesn't inherently understand borders between countries, and unified approaches are always better. But the EU and the US obviously approach things very differently. So I wanted to get your thoughts on both what you're asking EU regulators to look at as part of the AI Act, but also what you're seeing as far as the different approach between the EU and the US.
So yeah, there are a number, and just following up on our recent reports and the open loop program, there are a number of concrete recommendations that we've produced up. And I would like to focus on one of them, which is to, and I think this might be applicable to what we see both in the EU and the US, is to consider, taking a hard and thoughtful look at the taxonomy of AI actors in a way that would more accurately actually describe the possible interactions between them. We see that there might be an oversimplification on this dichotomy of you either provider or an user. And I think we need to delve deeper and better understand the complexity of the AI value chain and come up with a taxonomy that will better capture that complexity and would also help with issues around liability and responsibility. We see the AI Act that is approaching this regulation of AI systems in the same way as any other product category, like consumer products or medical devices. It sets rules for actors that are placing AI systems on the EU market. Those are the providers, and then those that are using these systems. And we we believe that there are a number of hybrid situations that might not be adequately covered by this dichotomy. Give you a couple of examples. If we think of an AI user that is developing the system alongside the provider, an AI user that develops AI in-house, when we have AI providers and users developing AI models using models of others, AI providers or AI providers that are developing AI using open source platforms. So these are a number of hybrid situations that need to be looked at it more attentively in order for us, when we think about legislation and the taxonomy of actors that will be asked to comply with a number of requirements, to have a closer look of what are the intricacy of these actors and how they actually interact with one another.
Excellent. Well, we're coming up to the top of the hour, and we're going to pivot to our conversation with MEP Tudorache, but I wanted to ask a last question of our panelists for you to share what you're most excited about as we move forward and see AI deployed around the world. Kristen, I'll start with you. Just a very quick 30 seconds on what you're most excited about AI.
Well, I think coming out of the G20, just as recently as yesterday, the commitment of India to focus on emerging tech going forward is very encouraging. I like to see that emerging tech in all of its forms is being recognized as something we really do need to pay attention to. The use cases, as you said, can be broad-ranging, super fabulous, and also dangerous, right? So the fact that even at the very highest levels, it's going to be taken seriously. I heard the Indian ambassador last night talking immediately about that's the top of their agenda as they head into leading the G20. So I'm excited that lawmakers are looking at it, that CISA is considering the security angles, best practices and all, as we get into those weeds, right? It's great to say policy principles, but how do you actually do it? You know, to the point of our fellow panelists, it's all in the weeds, right? How do you actually roll it out? So the level of attention that's increased on it is very encouraging to me at all levels.
Great. Grace, your closing thoughts on what you're most excited about AI deployment?
I'm excited about, I think, just the focus kind of like globally around high risk versus high risk approach. And so I think that what that does is it really will allow us to, you know, what I stated earlier is like harness the power of AI while mitigating harmful bias for all the communities. I think there's some amazing uses of AI ahead for us. And so we want to have that innovation continue to flourish, but we also want to make sure that, you know, the output of the AI isn't going to cause any unintended negative consequences for the communities around the world.
Great, thanks. And Norberto, your closing thought on your AI excitement?
Well, as a user, I'm very excited about all the opportunities that AI systems and features and new products will be offering. As a policy person, I'm fascinated by how rich and complex the AI governance debate is. It is a space where we see the confluence of so many different approaches and instruments in terms of regulation. You have legislation, you have ethical principles, you have industry guidelines, you have whole debate around standards, codes of conduct, and really understanding how all of these different approaches and regulatory instruments talk to one another and find the right balance and calibration is something that is really exciting, and I feel lucky to be working on this field.
Fantastic. Fantastic. That leaves us all with a sense of excitement about what's to come. Thanks, Norberto, Kristen, Grace, for joining us this morning to share your thoughts on the industry's perspective and efforts on AI. And next we head to Brussels, and I'm pleased to introduce my colleague, Courtney Lang, on the ITI team. She leads our AI global policy work, among other issues. Courtney will be joined in conversation by Dragoș Tudorache, who is a member of the European Parliament and a leader on AI policy issues. So with that, Courtney, over to you.
Great. Thank you, Jason. And hi, everyone. Thanks for being with us today. I will be joined here momentarily by Mr. Tudorache. There he is. All right. Wonderful. Hello. Good afternoon. For those of you that aren't familiar, Dragoș Tudorache is a member of the European Parliament and Vice President of the Renew Europe group. He is the chair of the Special Committee on Artificial Intelligence in the Digital Age and the Libe Rapporteur for the AI Act. He also sits on the Libe Committee, the Justice and Home Affairs Committee, as well as the Committee on Foreign Affairs, Subcommittee on Security and Defense, and is a part of the European Parliament's delegation for relations with the United States. So, Mr. Tudorache, really happy to have you join us today. I know that you have been very engaged on all sorts of things related to artificial intelligence and with us as well. So, we really are pleased to have you here to share your perspectives on how the EU is approaching artificial intelligence. And so I think, perhaps as kind of a scoping question to begin with, I'd love to ask you, earlier, I know that you weren't able to join us at the outset, but Congresswoman Kelly did mention that she's actually testified for your committee as well. And she mentioned, that the US is approaching AI a little bit differently than the EU. And I think mostly everyone in the audience is aware that the approaches are a little bit different, right, with the EU approaching artificial intelligence governance through the EU AI Act. But I wanted to kind of ask you at the outset how you think the US and the EU can best work together to ensure approaches to AI governance are aligned to the extent possible, given the fact that we are approaching things a little bit differently in different jurisdictions around the world.
Well, good morning, Courtney, and good morning to Iti, and good morning to Congresswoman Kelly. I don't know if she's still listening in, but if she is, congratulations for your re-election, most importantly. Well, I think that what we're doing is we need to keep on doing because I think we've started well, and we started well some years ago when we realized that in fact we share the principles, we share the broad understanding of the impact of artificial intelligence on our societies, and therefore we had a shared interest to converge on the approaches to bring about some sense of order in how the development of this technology is to take place. And even if in the course of these last months and years, we kind of realized that we're not going to have similar approaches in terms of the norms or the rules that would actually be adopted, I think we did come to a sense of shared understanding as to, again, what are the fundamental building blocks, what are the values that underpin our efforts, and also what is the common shared overall goal objective. And as I've said in many occasions when we discuss about this convergence between EU and the US when it comes to AI, I think that that's not a bad place to be. If we, again, share the values and the principles, and if we share the overall goal, that's already a very good starting point. And we also have had, over these last 2 years, we've had the TTC. And TTC has been a good framework where the two sides have worked together and not in a vacuum or on some very generic issues, but on some very concrete elements. Such as, for example, how do you measure bias in algorithms, such as the impact of AI on the labor market. So some very concrete projects that were given to the executive part of the TTC, to the working groups that were dedicated to AI. And the idea for the upcoming TTC in December is to actually take one step further and give it even a more sense of concreteness in the work that they will do, so that, again, we get even narrower and narrower in terms of trying to coincide with what we do on AI. There's also, and I think that was an important statement of intent on the part of the US administration, we had the AI Bill of Rights, which is something that we discussed when I first came to Washington as the chair of the Special AI Committee in the European Parliament, and I met with the White House. They were telling us then that this Bill of Rights would be issued, and now that we've seen it, basically it is an extra element in this quest towards convergence. What I think that we still need to do is to also align more politically, in a way, legislators to legislators. I've at least, and I know that Robin Kelly also, like me, believes that we need a bit of a stronger parliamentary scrutiny as to what happens in the TTC, also to add this sense of of political ownership for these objectives as well. So again, all in all, we're in a good place, good start. But as one panelist just connecting, I just heard one panelist saying this is also time to start getting a bit more concrete. The devil is always in the details, as we know, and I think that as we now progress with the TTC negotiations, with the discussions on standards and norms, I think we have to start paying real attention as to how we make it sure that we're not diverging in how we progress in this work.
Yeah, thank you. That's really helpful, especially as we come up on the next meeting of the Trade and Technology Council in just a couple of weeks here. So looking forward to seeing kind of the concrete outcomes of the AI subgroup there and some of the more, I think, concrete things that you mentioned that, you know, the US and the EU can work together on in order to start to facilitate an even more, I think, shared understanding of particular terms and areas, even if kind of the macro approaches are a bit different. I wanted to shift gears a little bit and just talk to you about the AI Act, as we heard from Congresswoman Kelly earlier about, you know, some of the various efforts that are ongoing in the United States, the AI Bill of Rights, the NIST AI Risk Management Framework, the ADPA and certain provisions within that legislation as well. You know, wanted to really get your take on, you know, a couple of things related to the AI Act itself. I think, you know, kind of as a broad question to follow up on kind of the conversation we were just having a few minutes ago about kind of the different approaches being taken here. Wanted to get your take on how you think the EU AI Act will be able to kind of remain flexible and evolve as the technology is also constantly evolving and adapting, and, you know, kind of how you're thinking about that in the Parliament and making sure that the legislation is really evergreen and fit for purpose, as, you know, the technology is still fairly nascent, and certainly, you know, there's a balance to be struck in terms of addressing potentially risky systems, but simultaneously ensuring that businesses are allowed to innovate and compete.
Well, it's a very good question, and it's a question that almost everyone has when we discuss AI, because it's true, as any technology, this is one that constantly leaps. And maybe more than any other piece of technology, AI leaps faster and further than many others. And by the time we're going to finish negotiating this text in 1 year's time, plus minus, AI of end of 2023 will certainly be already sometimes even exponentially different than the AI of today, at least in certain areas. So indeed, the very good question is, how do you make sure that the definition that you write today, or the criteria, or the compliance rules that you write today will be fit for the technology of tomorrow? And honestly, there isn't a silver bullet for that. There is no magic wand. And in fact, there is a quite good conversation to be had as to whether our legislative techniques are fit for this day and age, and they are fit for regulating the kind of technologies that we are trying to regulate right now. But that's a more philosophical conversation, not for today, but I think it's a conversation worth having. So anyway, coming back to the tools we have at our disposal, I think the best we can do, and this is what we're trying to do now as part of the negotiations in Parliament, and then later on when we're going to start negotiating with the European Council representatives, one of the key things would be to make sure that, again, as we write the definitions and the criteria, we make it in a way that is adaptable, so that we can cater for the evolutions of the technology and of the use cases that we're trying to put today in one category of risk or another, and that we can cater for the evolution of those use cases, and as they might and might not still fit in one category or another one. We have a trick up our sleeve in European lingo, which is called comitology, which is a much lighter procedure in legislative terms than the current one that we go through when you adopt a big legislative text like this one. And basically the attempt is to put all of those elements that would need to be future-proofed. You need to put them in annexes or in parts of the text, which you can then amend via this lighter procedure, so that you can then make sure that it stands the test of time. And then as you will need to adapt those parts of the rules or those parts of definitions, for example, you could do so much quicker and without having to go through the whole shenanigan of the negotiations that we have right now.
Got it. Yeah, that's helpful to know about kind of this other mechanism that's perhaps a bit more flexible and adaptable than, adopting the big regulation itself. So certainly that is going to be something that remains really important, as you know, moving forward, given the just rapid evolution of the technology itself. I wanted to ask you a little bit about your thoughts on the role of transparency. We just had a panel of several industry representatives talking about, the ways in which they are approaching, mitigating potential risks stemming from the use of AI. And there was discussion around kind of transparency as one potential tool to help do that. Can you talk a little bit more about how the AI Act itself incorporates transparency, and from your perspective, what the role of transparency should be in advancing trustworthy artificial intelligence?
Well, for me, and not only for me, in fact, almost I would say the entire philosophy of the AI Act and of the European thinking in terms of how you regulate AI is about transparency. Because the starting point was, how do you make sure that this is a technology that people trust? And why is it important to make sure that this is a technology that people trust? Because you have had a growing areas of concern when it came to AI, which had to do with its impact on human rights and interests in various areas, whether it was human resources management or creditworthiness assessments and so on and so forth. So the whole point of the conversation was, how do you make sure that, number one, people understand how this technology works when they make the assessments that they make about their lives or about their worthiness or about this or that, and how do we make sure that the algorithms themselves that are behind some of these processes, some of these services or products, are not black boxes. The whole black box that everyone is afraid of. You don't know what's in there. You don't know how the recommendation at the end comes out. You know that you put in some data here, but whatever happens inside, you don't see. So again, transparency from my point of view is in fact probably the most important exercise that is at the heart of the compliance mechanism that the AI Act envisages. So it's all about explainability. It's about transparency. The requirement to put yourself in a database at European level if you are in the category of risks is about transparency. So it's all, again, the whole philosophy is about opening up towards the user, if you want, towards the customer, opening up this area which so far has been by many portrayed as a bit of a Terminator for some, Big Brother for others, doesn't matter, but something that you need to fear because you don't understand, because you don't see, because it's a black box. So again, a lot of if one looks through the chapters of the Act that contains the requirements to be fulfilled by the use cases, either in the higher risk or in the medium risk categories, again, almost all of it, I would say, is about ensuring this degree of transparency. And also, because you mentioned that this was a reaction that you also got from the panelists representing the industry, this is also the feedback that I received in the countless conversations that I've had with representatives of the industry, who also say that they also see it in their own interests to ensure this level of transparency. What was happening so far is that many were taking their own different internal approaches in terms of how they're trying to go through some ethical checks and balances to ensure that, again, they sell a product or a service that people trust. So I think that, again, also as an exercise of self-discipline, which was what we had so far, but also once there will be clear and enforceable rules in place, transparency will remain the key factor that would give trustworthiness to AI.
Yeah, that makes good sense. And certainly, one of the major themes of our initial set of global AI policy recommendations that we released a couple of years ago now was around facilitating public trust in the technology and really the role of transparency and developing, meaningfully explainable AI systems so that the public does understand in certain instances, what either A, that they're interacting with an AI system, or B, in certain higher risk use cases, how that decision was made, if it's, fundamentally impacting them in some way. So certainly, appreciate that the feedback has been consistent across both industry, but also the conversations that you've had internally. Maybe another question around kind of how you're thinking about things with regard to the EU AI Act is certainly, you guys are taking a risk-based approach to the regulation of artificial intelligence, right? There's this focus on the high-risk AI systems having to meet a certain set of objectives or, conformity assessment requirements, et cetera. And so, really trying to target, those applications that are potentially risky and can impact fundamental rights, while allowing others to kind of proceed if they're non-problematic. I'd be interested to hear your take on kind of this notion of a risk-based approach or risk-based approaches in general, and maybe additionally thoughts about what criteria should contribute to its definition. I think one of the things that we've noticed in conversations with different policymakers around the world is, right now there's not necessarily kind of one set of criteria that folks are using to assess what constitutes a high-risk AI system. And that has, in some cases, created additional, I think, opportunity for fragmentation or divergence because of the way in which, high risk is being thought of in different places. And so would be interested to hear your thoughts on kind of how you think of high risk and whether there are kind of specific criteria that might be able to be kind of adopted across borders, if you will.
Well, let's start with the approach itself. I think the approach itself of putting risk as the fundamental measuring stick for an AI that needs to be regulated and one that doesn't, and which is, I think from my point of view, is the shared entry point, both in the US understanding and vision, as well as in the European one. And I would dare say, most likely, this is going to be more as the global entry point for any attempt to regulate or put norms around AI, no matter at what level. So again, the approach itself, I think, is the only sensible approach at this stage. Why? Because number one, it makes sure that 80-90% of the AI there remains in a way unregulated, as it should be. Because in this effort to create some rules for what might be risky AI, we certainly cannot forget the fact that this is a technology that needs to be embraced, needs to be uptaken, needs to be encouraged, because this is going to be the engine of the digital transformation that we go through. And therefore, again, most of the AI needs to be encouraged and needs to be allowed to flourish and develop and grow and innovate and so on and so forth. So again, I think taking the risk as the key differentiator, as I said, between that needs to be regulated and that doesn't is I think the only way to do it. What we've done in our legislation, or at least the approach so far, is this sort of famous by now pyramid of risk. So you have at the tip of the pyramid, you have few applications that we would consider that need to be prohibited because they are so detrimental, so risky in a way for human endeavor and human interest that we simply cannot have them on our market. And then there's going to be a discussion, still not settled yet in our negotiations, as to which ones should be in, which ones should be out. Should biometric remote identification be in or out? Should predictive policing be in or out? Should social scoring be in or out? Well, social scoring, I don't think there's a debate on that. Most political groups agree that it should be in. The big debate is going to be on biometrics and predictive policing, from what I can see. Close bracket. Then you have the second floor, which is the high risk use cases, which are going to be described in a separate list. There again, we are still hard at work. Number one, in figuring out how long and how short the list should be. Should it be an exhaustive list or just an enumeration? This also links to the discussion on adaptability and future proofing. And then, very importantly, as you rightly said, what is the criteria? What are the criteria? And there, in the initial Commission proposal, actually, there wasn't a lot about criteria. I think that was one of the things that was missing in the Commission proposal. And that's something on which we here in Parliament will be hard at work in the coming weeks. In fact, we're having the first discussion on the risk, let's say, on how we define the risk, how do we assess the risk, should we actually apply a particular risk assessment to any use case that would end up being in the high risk category or not. So these are some political question marks that we will discuss with my shadow rapporteurs as of next week. And I think will be harder the discussion for the coming weeks until the year's end, because that's probably one of the most important debate that we're going to have in this text, because it's going to determine again how broad or how narrow this annex with the high risk use cases will end up. And again, whether there will be some very clear entry criteria to be on the list or not. From my point of view, just to be clear where I stand, I want the highest precision possible when it comes to what ends up in this list of high-risk AI. Precision in the way the use cases will be defined, and also precision in the way you would filter out those that should not be in just because you've put some sort of a blanket label on a particular area and you consider it to be prone to risk simply because it's human resource management, or simply because it's, I don't know, critical infrastructure or so again, I'm not a big fan of labeling entire areas and say that an entire area is high risk. But how will these criteria be defined? That's something that we're still going to fight it out politically in the weeks to come.
Yeah, fair enough. Glad to hear that you're, advocating for precision. I do think that there's, significant nuance that goes into particular uses within a sector, right? So depending on how a system is used, even if it's in, human resources management, it matters, where it's deployed and what it's ultimately impacting. So interested to see how that unfolds during negotiations and where you guys end up on that. We're already kind of getting close to the end of our time, but maybe 1 to 2 more questions, depending on how much time we have left. Wanted to also ask you about your perspectives on the allocation of responsibilities between different players in the AI ecosystem, right? Because there are a variety of actors, including AI providers, AI users, importers of AI technology, and they're all kind of going to need to comply with a different set of requirements based on, whether or not their AI is high risk. So given the complexity of kind of that ecosystem, how do you see kind of the allocation of responsibilities, particularly when it comes to things like general purpose models, which don't necessarily have kind of an intended purpose at the end of the day? How do you think the responsibilities between actors can be best allocated?
Well, I think the whole value chain in an AI system, whether product or service, is a very complex affair, or many of them are very complex affair with bits and pieces. Well, some of them may be as straightforward, simple, and therefore it's very clear whoever puts it on the market bears the responsibility for it. But in other cases, the questions are more complex. And as you rightly said, one of the big elephants in our political room is indeed general purpose AI, or what is called, maybe too generically from my point of view, general purpose AI, because not everything that some people like to call general purpose is general purpose in my view, but anyway, that's a different conversation. So anyway, the question is, if indeed, as you rightly say, you have an algorithm, you have a machine that is not being given an objective by its producer, but it can do things. It is a potent algorithm that can do a lot of things, but you can ask it today to give you the molecule of an antibiotic, and tomorrow you can ask it to, I don't know, play chess, and the day after tomorrow you can ask it to sort through CVs to help you in a recruitment process. Well, the answer to that question is that the responsibility will ultimately be with whoever gives it a purpose. That purpose comes under that list of high-risk use cases. and whoever feeds data into that algorithm to then and gives an objective to achieve an end. We are now playing with the concept of significant change in the way we will be trying to define this sort of sequence of responsibility between providers, users, importers, so on and so forth. To make it clear that whoever takes a product that in itself, again, even if it's on the market, either it sits on a shelf because it's a product that companies do generically and that anyone can take it and then use it to do something else, or whether it's tailor-made for someone, but again, it's tailor-made up to a point where it does not yet serve a purpose, even if it was maybe trained with some data to get to the level of complexity that it's required. But again, it was not allocated to a particular objective. Again, as long as you are in that area, you are not falling under the application of the law. The moment either yourself or someone else takes it and allocates it to a particular risky objective, then you come under the obligations under the law. The question is, how do you also solve the relationship between one and the other, particularly since the one who will be putting it on the market and giving it a risky objective might need data or information from the first provider, let's say, because otherwise they cannot respect the transparency obligations. We're speaking of transparency. And there is, in my view, something that needs to be sorted out by the market forces themselves. I don't think we can prescribe in law, no matter how much we would try, via a definition, the actual mechanics of how much responsibility is passed on from A to B. I think, again, I would leave it for contracts and agreements between parties, as long as it's clear that this one, B, bears the responsibility, but uses something from A. Well, the relationship between A and B, the contractual relationship, is something that I would, again, leave the market to decide in order for B to comply with the rules under the Act. So that's a bit where, again, my thinking is, but we're still hard at discussing this with the other political groups as well.
Got it. Well, with all of that being said, I think we're at the end of our time here. Once again, really appreciate you taking the time to be here with us today and for your continued engagement with industry on these important issues. We're looking forward to, seeing where Parliament lands and to seeing an eventual agreement. But sounds like there's still, quite a lot of negotiating going on some of these.
Well, you'll still have to be patient for about three months or so, 4 months max.
Okay.
And then you'll see the final product.
All righty. Well, great. We'll stay tuned. We'll hold our breath for the next 3 or 4 months until we see the text. But again, really, really appreciate your time here today. So I think we'll end there and see you soon. So we've reached the end of our event today, everyone, but certainly not the end of this conversation. As you heard from all of our distinguished guests today, a lot going on in the artificial intelligence space. So want to thank all of our speakers for joining us this morning. We really appreciate you sharing your time and knowledge with us. Please be sure to follow ITI at ITI_tech tweets and find us on LinkedIn to stay connected and stay up to date on other events that we're doing. So we'll be reaching out soon with more information on our next event in this ongoing Bridge for Innovation series. And in the meantime, please take a minute to join us at bridgeforinnovation.org, which you can see on your screen to learn more. Thanks again, everyone, and have a great day.